It's a go-kart.
I picked up this 9 horsepower Trail Runner go-kart on Facebook Marketplace that had been abandoned behind an old shed and under a tarp for a long time so that I could prepare for Jimmy DiResta's upcoming July 4th go-kart race. This thing is pretty sweet and has a really nice 9 horsepower Tecumseh motor on it, and I'm excited to get it up and running and back on the track. So when I bought it, it was having a little trouble starting, but after a couple of pulls, I can get it to fire up, and I'm just going to warm up the motor so that I can go ahead and start this restoration off with an oil change. I was getting a little bit of smoke out of the exhaust, so I think an oil change would definitely be a good idea. So to start off, I'll pull the oil pan bolt out, and I'll let that oil just completely soak the back end of the cart. I'll tip up the front so that I can get it to drain a little bit better, but it's no problem. I'm going to be using some WD-40 brand Specialist degreaser, and you can easily get into hard to reach places with that straw over on the front, and this is going to help me get all the latent oil and any grease that might be sitting on the back end of the motor so that I can eventually paint this little area. Now the cart's generally pretty clean, but it was left outside and it's having some trouble with the tires, so we're going to have to address that, the seat, the wiring, and the carburetor, a bunch of other little things. Now the seats have been completely soaked and dried, and the bottom of that is actually plywood and it's completely rotted out. I'm going to be using the WD-40 Specialist penetrant spray with the Easy Reach straw, which allows you to spray in 2 ways, a narrow stream using the straw and a wide spray using the nozzle. This will help me loosen the bolts, keeping the seat down. I'm going to be redoing the seat, and I'm also going to be replacing the seat belts to try to make it just a little bit more safe. Now the seat is just a metal pan which has these vinyl and foam covers that go over it, and the seat belts mount to that bolt section there in the center. So these bolts were pretty well rusted on, but I was able to free them up and get the bolts out, and I'll replace all that stuff after I'm done cleaning up the seat. I'll use some WD-40 original formula to loosen up some of the rust that's on the choke cable and the throttle cables, and this with the combination of the Scotch-Brite will help restore it back to its former glory. Now I want to get any of the oil and grease off the back end of the motor and all these sections back here so that I can paint everything. And there's also some random brackets. I don't know what they were attached to, but they're not doing much now, so I pulled those off. The seat's generally really dirty, so I used the degreaser again to clean this all up in preparation for paint. Now overall, the cart's not very rusty, but this seat, I think because the plywood was completely saturated, had some rust on it. So before I paint it, I just take a wire wheel to loosen up any of the surface rust, and then I'm going to use some Rust-Oleum enamel paint to clean this up and try to encapsulate that rust. You're never going to see that because of the seat, but I don't want it to continue to rust and corrode and then eventually break the seat pan. Now I go ahead and take the wire wheel, which is over on a variable speed angle grinder, makes it a lot more manageable, to kind of clean up any other latent rust that I find so that I can start to sort of spot paint this thing. Now I know there's going to be some criticism that I didn't take the entire thing apart and give it a beautiful paint job, but I plan on kind of abusing this. So I'm just sort of taking the paint can and rattle canning what I can get to in black, and then I'll go ahead and touch up the red as well. In the end, I don't think the paint job's the most important thing. It's got to function, and that's what I'm going for. Now the rear tires have some pretty bad dry rot, and the front tires actually kept popping the bead off of the rim, and we're going to start with the rear tires. Now the actual bolts on the axles are pretty well seized up on there, so I'm going to pull these cotter pins out and then use my big impact wrench to try to break those nuts free, and use again the WD-40 Specialist penetrant spray to try to loosen up any rust on those big nuts on this axle. The big impact does a great job pulling those off, and then I can go ahead and pull these wheels off, bring them inside, and start the process of changing these tires.
All right, so a quick break from the video to talk about a contest that is being run by this video sponsored, which is WD-40 brand. WD-40 brand and Lowe's have teamed up for the Repair It, Don't Replace It contest. Now, the first prize on this contest is $3,000, and there's a bunch of prizes that kind of come down from that for second, third, fourth, and fifth place. Now, we've all been there. You've got something in the garage or something in your yard that you're thinking, well, I could spend my time fixing it, or I could just go buy a new one. But a lot of times, new stuff isn't made the way that old stuff was. And with enough ingenuity and enough tools, you really can fix anything. I spend a lot of time in my shop restoring old things, restoring tools that have a history, that have a story, not much unlike the go-kart that I'm currently working on. This thing was abandoned underneath a tarp behind a house, and it could have gone to the landfill, but instead, It's looking great, and it's gonna be something that I use and my family uses for years to come, if I've got anything to do with it. There's no better feeling than bringing new life to something that could have wound up in the garbage, but we're gonna sweeten the pot by adding on this $3,000 grand prize for the best submission to the Repair It, Don't Replace It contest. There'll be details down below in the description, and you can enter until July 17th, 2023. So I look forward to seeing your submissions there, and good luck.
You can enter at repair.wd40.com.
Now let's get back to the video.
So with the tires inside, I can get the air out, and then I can use my bead breaking hammer to pop these at least off of the bead of the rim, and then I can use some tire levers to pull these tires off. Now these are probably the original tires that came on the cart, and my assumption is that this cart's about 20 years old. So the rims are actually in really good shape considering, and I bought these really meaty mud tires because I plan on riding this thing mostly in the dirt, and they weren't really that bad to mount. Most people think you need a tire machine to mount tires like this, but I've found some guys on TikTok and Instagram that use some vice grips and tire levers, and they mount huge tires in the field. So I figured if they can do it, I can figure it out too. Now I didn't have any starting fluid, which is normally how I would try to set a tire bead, so I tried this trick with 2 ratchet straps. And I had tried with one, and I really didn't have any luck. What I found was 2 ratchet straps closer to the edge of the bead of the tire, and by kind of tightening them as I gave air, I was able to get that bead to set, and once it was set, I could continue to put air in these tires, and they held on the rim really, really well. This definitely wasn't the easiest thing. You can see I'm kind of pressing and moving my knee and moving the straps, but eventually I was able to get both of the tires inflated, and that's without starting fluid inside my shop. So I was pretty happy with that, and I thought it was a great success. Mounting tires can be pretty tricky, especially tubeless, but it worked out. Now I'm using the WD-40 Specialist Gel Lube on those axles and the little axle spacer just to make sure everything's nice and lubricated before I put the wheels and tires back on. Now I'm changing out the cotter pins that were there, but I'm definitely making sure to reinstall them. It is a castle nut on the end of the axle, and if you don't put those cotter pins in, one of those axles will actually self-loosen and that thing will go flying. Now somebody had done kind of a hack job with this wiring here, so I pulled the wiring harness apart and actually disconnected some of the wires and the ground so that I could go ahead and rewire this and clean it up. I think what had happened was eventually this wire must have gotten loose, so somebody had like a bread twist tie on it, and it had clearly hit the muffler and exhaust and had definitely melted the carrier a little bit. It doesn't take much to clean up this wiring, and it's very simple. Lucky for me, the headlights already work, so I don't have to do any electrical kind of figuring out there, and then I can move ahead with some more wire wheeling eventually to paint the frame. Now, this wire wheel is from Fair Abrasives. It's a loose wheel, and it does a great job just sort of cleaning up any latent rust. And then I'm just using some Rust-Oleum Candy Apple Red paint to paint this thing with a piece of cardboard as sort of a mask, so I can avoid not painting things like the shocks or the front suspension, because I want to kind of keep this looking nice. I don't want it to look like too much of a hack job, but the paint goes a long way, and you can already see this thing brightening up. Now I'm sort of getting in and around everything, but using a piece of cardboard, if you're careful, can really help you paint things quickly as a nice mask. And I like to use a relatively small piece because if you use anything too big, it just becomes unwieldy. Now the back section, the sort of rear, I decided to paint a flat black. I think it was originally gray, but somebody had sort of hacked it up. So I'm able to get in there and easily paint this, paint the rear suspension, which had already been painted a few times, and give a little bit of paint to the gas tank just to sort of clean things up and make them look nice. Spray paint goes a long way. It's like a cleaner, but better. Now I'm going to take this little muffler cover off, and I'm going to clean the actual exhaust with the wire wheel. This is, I believe, an aluminum exhaust. I was having a little bit of trouble getting it clean, and it kept kind of falling apart. I was originally going to try to pull this off and really give it a good clean, but I could tell that the exhaust bolts were completely rotted, and I was worried if I tried to take them off, they would break. I used some high heat paint to paint that muffler cage, and then I can quickly reinstall it with these zip screws, which is just going to help clean up the whole look. The next thing to tackle was this headrest. So these also have a kind of OSB wood backer, and that thing had completely fallen apart. The little T-nuts that were in there had broken off, and they were completely seized with rust. So I actually had to go in with the grinder and cut those off. Now, the vinyl and the foam on these seat pads are actually in pretty good shape, so there's no need to replace that, but I do have to go ahead and pull the seat pad apart, get all that disgusting and rotted wood out of there, and then I'll be able to rebuild it. I'm glad I didn't have to stitch and redo this vinyl, but all I had to do here was take some plywood and basically use the foam as a guide to cut the plywood. I sanded the edges smooth, and then I can refit them inside the vinyl seat cover, headrest cover, and then I can get it all kind of put back together with a stapler. Now, this is a super easy process, nothing fancy here, but one thing I did have to remember to do was re-add the T-nuts in the correct location. So once I had it fitted, I made some little marks with a Sharpie, and then I drilled 2 holes that I could fit these 5/16 T-nuts through, and this is just going to allow me to bolt this the way that it was originally bolted by the factory, but I'm sure this 3/4 inch plywood is going to hold up better than the OSB that was originally there. So if you wind up with a go-kart or something like this that you need to repair, it's very easy to do if you can get a wood backer in there. And then I'm just using a T50 stapler to kind of clean it up. Some of my staples went in the wrong spot, so I kind of moved those out of the way. And then I decided to cut the holes in the back of the headrest a little cleaner. And then I added a couple more staples just to keep that vinyl from moving around. And I think that the headrest pad looks really good. Brand new. Now, I wanted to change out the front tires as well. As I mentioned, when I bought it, these were coming off the bead, and I was having a little trouble keeping them on there. Plus, they're pretty well dry rotted. So I ordered some dirt tires for here, and the first thing I noticed is that these bearings are actually completely shot.
This wheel bearing is shot. Luckily, I found the race, so I can order a new one off the number.
So obviously I want to have good bearings in the front of this bike, so I popped the old bearings out and got the new tires seated. It was a real challenge to get these tires on. Mac and I fought with starting fluid and ratchet straps, and eventually we did get them to set. They were very, very difficult. Now, one of the things that was interesting was that these wheels are using a snap ring bearing. So it's a bearing that has a little snap ring to dictate its depth within the hub. Basically what this does is it allows the manufacturer to just use a piece of pipe as the wheel hub, and the bearing is set by that snap ring. So once I got those mounted and in there, I decided to shake up another can of paint and paint the front section of this suspension. Now, I think originally this might have been black or gray, but somebody painted it red along the way, and honestly, I think it looks pretty good in red. My goal here is to try to keep the suspension and the cage from getting paint on them and overspray. So as I kind of painted this, I cleaned things off as I went, and I painted the floorboards as well because I had previously run out of paint. Now in this case, I don't want to get any paint on the axles, so I masked those off, but everything else can get a nice heavy coat of this Rust-Oleum because it's just going to help protect any rust from damaging the steel frame. Overall, this thing was honestly in really good structural shape. Before I go any further, I took my grease gun and I put some grease in the Zerk fittings on those front axles and put some grease on the actual axle themselves just to kind of act as a resistance to any wearing or any binding that these bearings might have. You can see how nice those new tires look. I'm really excited to get these things in the dirt. Now it's got to be careful not to over tighten those front axle nuts, so I'm going to put some spacers in there in the future. Now I can remount that headrest that I made earlier and tighten that up. And then just to make it all match, I grabbed some black spray paint and spray painted the heads of those bolts. So the next thing to do was to clean the carburetor, which I hadn't done previously. I think there was some schmutz in there. Which was interesting about this was that the carburetor has like a quick release float bowl, but in general it was actually in pretty good shape. Now this is a 9 horsepower Tecumseh motor, and I tried to get a performance carb for this, but I couldn't find them that was fit. But I do get to use the WD-40 Specialist carb body and choke cleaner, and I was able to clean everything off of here, get any debris or dirt that may have gotten sucked in through the air filter, and get that float bowl and everything all maintained. And I can put it back together and know that I'm going to have a clean running carburetor for when I take this thing out to the racetrack. Now, I usually try not to clean a carburetor out in the field, but this one was so simple I figured I could manage it. And I did eventually wind up breaking the fuel inlet on the float bowl, which caused me to have to go out and buy another one. But before I did that, I added a fuel cutoff switch, which didn't exist previously, basically just so that I can make sure I don't have any fuel excessively going into the carb. And then I put the old air filter on, but quickly you'll see that I replaced that with a brand new one just to get a little bit better performance out of this. Now, of course, while I was test riding it, I broke the pull starter, and then I had to replace it with a brand new one. I mean, if you're going to do it, might as well do it all. And this new one just came from Amazon for 15 bucks and works perfect. A little more black spray paint just to keep things nice and clean, and we can keep on moving. The next thing was to install some safety gear. I bought some retracting seat belts on Amazon. They say these are fit for a truck. I have some doubts, but either way, I think they're going to work good on the go-kart. The original seat belts you had to adjust in order to get them to fit, and these have that kind of retracting ratchet mechanism like a regular car does. It just took a little bit of kind of figuring out on how to mount them properly, but once they were on, I'm really happy with them. Generally, obviously, I want this thing to be safe, and I don't want anybody falling out of it if it does roll, so I think these are good to have. Now, these came with both the male and female side, but I did have some trouble when I bought these. Both of the packages that I bought had one seatbelt that didn't work, so I was able to combine them to make one working pair. So buyer beware. I will put a link to these down in the description, though. Now, with the seat all painted, I can remount it, and I chose to slide it back as far as I possibly could to give myself the maximum amount of legroom. Now I'm just using some new hardware on all of this. I kind of should have used stainless, but it's okay to use this kind of zinc coated stuff. I think I'm going to be keeping this thing covered up. It's not going to be outside the way that it was previously, so hopefully all this hardware lasts a lot longer than it did previously. Now I was going to make a new seat from scratch, but I found this one on eBay for $100, and I thought there's no way I could buy the vinyl, the foam, or the plywood for that amount of money, so I just went ahead and bought this. Now this had a T-nut in the bottom to bolt it to the seat pan, but unfortunately it was not in the right position, so I made a mark, I brought it inside, and I was actually able to replace that little seat pan bolt. Now I'm just sort of checking the fitment, making sure that it's the right kind of setup for me, and then I do a little trick here to pull that T-nut in a little tighter, which is put a bunch of washers and then tighten it up, and then I can go ahead and restaple the vinyl because I did have to disconnect it to move the T-nut. I cut a hole in that little connecting piece of vinyl, which I think is going to do exactly what I need it to, kind of just keep everything clean, keep water from getting down there. I hope it doesn't collect too much debris though. Last but not least, I changed out the air filter, which is just going to give me some nice clean air into that carburetor, and this thing is ready to rip. Last but not least, add a don't die sticker front and center so you make sure you know your instructions, and this thing is off to the track.